Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of AI Governance Watch. I'm Guru Sethupathy, the GM of AI Governance at Optro, and I have with us today Dave Kasten, Head of Policy at Palisade Research. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Drew. So glad to be here. It's always great to talk with you.
Awesome. Well, look, you're in a little different situation than a lot of other folks that I've had on the podcast, and I'd love to delve into your background and kind of what you're doing at Palisade Research. So, if you can share more with me and the audience of, what does Palisade Research do? A little bit about your role, and how did you land in this kind of role?
Yeah, so Palisade Research is a nonprofit. It's primarily based in the Bay Area in California. I'm their DC guy, although we are intending to expand our DC presence. We research AI's capabilities and behavior in order to try to understand the technical and national security implications of that. So a lot of what we do is we have sort of three strands of work. There's a whole team that's doing sort of technical research, creating results about, when AIs might choose to ignore various kinds of instructions they're given or might engage in certain types of behavior that might be harmful in various ways. We have a whole team of folks that are dedicated to sort of helping enable public discourse around AI in a more effective way. And then we have the policy team, which is, headed by me, which engages policymakers and sort of policy influencers in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in order to try to help them make better decisions around AI.
And what in your career, how did you get to this point, right? Like, what have you done along the way, and why is this important to you right now?
Yeah, so I have bounced around a lot. I'm definitely someone who is on the generalist end of being a generalist. So I graduated in 2008. I used to joke that was the worst time ever to graduate. And then I met some people who graduated in 2020, and I don't make that joke anymore. But, it was kind of a weird time. I ended up finding my way into government contracting after a stint as a bartender. I ended up working as a government contractor at Booz Allen for a couple of years. Then after that, I made a move to McKinsey, which is where we originally met, and worked there on and off for a period of about 7 years. In between various stints there, I did a couple other things. Most notably, I was on the corporate strategy team at Activision Blizzard for about 2.5 years. Then, sort of at the end of 2022, I was in a role at McKinsey where I was helping them with some of their sort of cybersecurity and data protection risk management stuff internally, that is, for McKinsey itself. And sort of some of those things were getting more sorted out. Sort of the team was reorging, and my boss came to me and said, "Hey, total candor, your job's going to get less interesting. We're still thrilled to have you here if you want to stay, but you might want to go look at other things to do." And then, long story short, I ended up doing a long search of figuring out what I wanted to do next. And ultimately, some friends of mine who I had met doing some volunteering during the COVID pandemic recommended me some folks who ended up hiring me for a job at a London-based nonprofit that did some work on AI policy. And after a year and a half there, I transitioned to Palisade.
Very cool. And look, you and I have chatted a bunch about this topic of AI and AI risks. And that's a broad category, right? You can cut it up in a couple different ways. Some are like short-term risks and some are longer-term existential risks. You
Yep.
can also cut it up into like business and consumer risks versus national security risks, right? Most of my audience here and what I often talk about are kind of the business side of things, kind of the governance of AI systems in the business world, in the at organizational level and business level risks. Yours touches on that, but is much more focused on, I think, national security. But tell me a little bit more about your remit here when you think about AI risks.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely fair that, mainly what we're focused on in terms of our policy recommendations has to do around helping, primarily federal level policymakers in Congress, the executive branch, and sort of the whole national security ecosystem around it, really think through what the implications are of AI becoming very powerful now and even more powerful in the very near future.
Mhm.
We believe quite strongly, based on some research that's been done by a lot of our colleagues in the field, most notably the folks at METR, which have said essentially, look, the sort of autonomy of an AI model, the
Mhm.
length of task that it could successfully do on its own without human intervention
Mhm.
was doubling every 7 months. Now it's
Wow.
doubling probably roughly every 4-ish month, has even accelerated from that. And we expect it to only accelerate even more. So you very plausibly could
To the
have.
acceleration of capabilities. It's not just the constant,
Yep.
exponential growth. It's an acceleration of the
That's
exponential.
right, exactly. So
Wow.
we're above the bets fit exponential curve at this point. And I think, the broad industry expectation, or which I think is not understood by many folks, even sort of the broader tech industry, or much less Washington, is that, sort of the core AI labs really do think they're going to at least ride that exponential curve for quite some time. And so, a lot of what I'm trying to do and a lot of what Palisade is trying to do is just help policymakers become aware of that. What you choose to do with that, what you think are the right interventions, we certainly have perspectives, but we want people to have a good model of the world in order to be able to make good decisions, whether or not they're necessarily exactly the interventions that we would propose. And I think one area probably of overlap between our work and sort of the work of many of the folks who are listening to this podcast is that, we very much use AI in every aspect of what we do. There are
Mhm.
folks elsewhere in the AI policy space who kind of say, hey, for various reasons, we kind of don't feel comfortable using AI for, call them moral or aesthetic reasons. Totally respect folks who are in that place. But for us, we're a small nonprofit. We try to get as much leverage as we can, not only in terms of our research, but also our day-to-day operations out of them. And let me tell you, like one of the things that has really become notable over the past couple of months is how that exponential pace has meant that there's things that we just couldn't automate that now we trivially automate. And, I think we just like, many of your enterprise customer listeners on this are all climbing that curve together, right?
Yep. A couple of things you said that I wanna actually note. One is it's actually pretty cool, something that Palisade does that, the audience might wanna know. You guys actually test frontier models. Like, you are some of the leaders in actually going in and testing its capabilities and trying to probe and prod on where its capabilities are and where they kind of fall short, and so I think that's phenomenal. The other piece that you mentioned, which I think everybody should know, just not policymakers, is this exponential curve. And exponential curves are very hard for just humans to understand in general. This is just we all struggle with this. And I think the analogy I often come back to, which is useful, is COVID, of how, quickly it progressed, where people were describing kind of the state of affairs today, but 3 months out, the world was going to look completely different, right? 100 cases were going to look like not like 200 cases, but thousands of cases. And so, how quickly that changed, I think was shocking to people because of that exponential curve. And the same here, where people are still looking oftentimes at its capabilities 3 months ago, 6 months ago, maybe even today, but like in a kind of, a different version of it, and not realizing how capable it is. And so what keeps you up at night? See, given where Palisade is and seeing the frontier of these models and what you guys are testing, what keeps you up at night, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, a lot keeps you up at night. You know, aside from my cat jumping on me at 3 in the morning, I think the things that most keep me up at night, we sort of talk about misuse, concentration of power, and loss of control, right?
Mhm,
So misuse is everything from call it sort of more small scale criminal misuse, people engaged in
mhm.
fraud, child safety violations, of course, which are terrible, sort of call it ordinary crime, for lack of a
Right,
better term, although obviously
right.
it's devastating to those it happens to sort of more higher end nation state and non-state terrorist
Mm,
actor abuse of these models around things like chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, as
yeah,
well as cyber, which is something that the national security community is extremely focused on right now. As the time of this taping in late June, we're currently in the midst of the sort of national security community freaking out about sort of the cyber capabilities that we're seeing
right,
proprietary models have, and open weight models are probably going to have similar capabilities within 0 to 12 months, depending on who you talk
right.
to. And, so we're seeing a lot of concern around that misuse. I think there's a separate stream of concern around how is having very powerful, very autonomous agents in our society going to change the balance of power. Obviously, in many ways,
Mhm.
this is benign or good, right? Like there are, many things that I can think of in terms of like nonprofit work or for-profit work I've done in the past where I would have loved to have arbitrarily many agents do work for me. I can think of lots of things I would have done with them that would have been great and helpful. But also you can imagine worlds where this means that, constraints we now have on various institutions in society that are dependent on them needing to hire and convince humans to do work for them no longer are the case. Whether that's, in sort of concerns about sort of balance of power within sort of government itself or between governments or between the government and the people. Lots of different ways you can slice it, but definitely a concern there. And then the last is the one that I think the people that I talk to who work at are sort of senior technical leaders at the AI companies are the most worried about, which is really building very powerful models that can sort of outplan, outwork, and outfight entire governments. This is something that I think, if you're not thinking of that exponential, feels obviously kind of hard to believe, right? Like, how could that possibly be? But if you're thinking about, okay, where was a model 3 years ago? It could barely string a sentence together.
Right.
Where are they now? They can write entire massive apps as a one shot and pose nation state level cybersecurity risks, as well as just barely short nation state level risks on things like bio and things like that. You get a sense of why the people who are senior technical leaders at places like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google DeepMind are very worried about the trajectory of this in the near future. And so a lot of what we try to do is we try to help policymakers understand that like the current trajectories, unless something breaks, which it might, stranger things have
Mhm.
happened by a lot, But on the current trajectories, that's where we're headed in the very near future, within the perspective of the labs, 1 to 3 years. The joke goes that if the long term to someone at the labs means more than 12 months.
Exactly. At the rate things are progressing. I mean,
Yep.
look, there's a bunch of topics you covered there, but especially for our audience, this view of like using AI by criminals, fraudsters, hackers, that whole risk surface area, I talk about this often, that whole surface area has expanded
Yep.
because we're no longer talking about hackers trying to grab data. We're talking about hackers who can hack into the agents in your company and get them to do all sorts of work, right?
Yep.
Incorrectly or to their advantage, malicious work, and really undermine your business fundamentally. And I still think CISOs and other folks are still not quite capturing what's possible here, both in terms of the potential of this technology, but the risks and the negative side of nefarious actors, Dave.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think, I think there's a couple things that you said that just resonate with me. One of them is that, I think people's way of thinking about sort of software risk has traditionally been very much
Yeah.
focused on sort of the application level or the permissions level. Like, what can this particular
Right.
piece of
Right.
software, what is it like supposed to be allowed to do? And then what does it actually have permissions to do? Maybe we misconfigured something or didn't understand our own network environment or whatever, right? We haven't yet really thought very much about what happens if you have an agent internal to your network that not only has a bunch of permissions, but also has the ability to like sort of think about your network and
Yeah.
systematically think through what would it do to to exploit to get more access. Now, I think first off, most people don't realize that models sometimes kind of do behaviors like this for no malicious reason. Like if you tell them, and we've done research on this, as have other colleagues, if you tell a model, hey, solve these problems unless you get an order to be shut down.
Right.
Sometimes when you do that, the model will say, no, I really want to keep on solving math problems. I'm just going to hack my own environment and delete the stretch-down script so I can keep on solving math problems. Obviously, solving math problems is in of itself not a risk to any enterprise, but it's an example of how these models sometimes can
They
engage.
go rogue. They go rogue. Yep.
They go rogue. And then, of course, you can imagine with a malicious attacker that somehow either subverts an agent that's already in an environment, or for that matter, installs their own environment agent in the environment, an open weights model or something like that. You could have much more expansive sort of risks being posed by that. Something that looks more like an insider threat or in government counterintelligence kind of conception of this rather than sort of a more traditional, we have a SOC, we kind of look to see what stuff is running on our network, we look at the traffic and it's good enough. Like that won't be sufficient against these kinds of attackers very soon now.
Yeah. What do you see as the challenge? Because you're talking to policymakers.
Yep.
And so, the technology is moving so quickly. We need to obviously build an ecosystem. And I often use the automobile ecosystem as an analogy, right? You talk about the whole supply chain for an
Mhm.
automobile to exist. You talk about all the software that's there to protect and govern and provide safety. You talk about the insurance market. You talk about the regulatory space. You talk about all the people that from the traffic cops to the DMV that play a role in kind of working, right? Like we're going to need a whole ecosystem around AI on all these different dimensions, but that's moving slowly. And what do you see are the challenges here? Are these challenges technological challenges, political challenges, capabilities? Like, well, what's slowing us down from building out this ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think a bunch of things to note. The first is that I think it's important to remind people that part of the problem here is simply that AI is growing at such a faster rate than almost any other type of consumer technology, right? There are a bunch of different ways you can measure this and proxy it and whatever, but like pick your favorite chart.
Hmm.
It is something case where the broad consumer and business adoption of these is way faster than, Web 2.0 or anything
Right.
like that. Pick your sort of jargon term. This is just faster. So first off, everyone should be a little kind to themselves and just recognize that there's some unprecedented pace of adoption going on
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Second thing is that I think really thinking through, you know, how is this exponential like not only going to be threatening you, but also going to potentially be benefiting you, right? So,
Hmm.
like, there's efforts that are sort of outside the scope of an individual leader that are already underway. Things like sort of, at both OpenAI and Anthropic have sort of these special, like sort of limited access programs where they're working on cybersecurity stuff. And yeah, they're working on it to some degree for their big corporate clients, but also a lot of those are patching sort of open source tools that are used by the broader ecosystem. So like really think about how to be keeping yourself up to date as stuff is going on, right? And like sort of taking advantage of that work going elsewhere in the ecosystem. This is sort of, basic, things around cybersecurity, just like patch your stuff, keep it up to date,
Right.
but like really think about that now. And then I think the last thing is like, I think we will ultimately see this being in many ways somewhat defender favorable in the long run. There's going to be a lot of turbulence along the way. And I think it will be offense favorable for a long period of time. But eventually you'll have the point where you'll be able to say, hey, look, I used to be limited in the number of people that I could have in my SOC, particularly on like the overnight shift that no one wants to staff. Well,
Yeah.
now I have the ability to
You
have
have agents
arbitrarily
running guns.
many. Yeah. And so I think we're ultimately going to be in a better shape on this. I do think that like this is something where, normally the advice is when you're in a period of uncertainty, you kind of just go to cash, right? And you kind of like avoid making investments. Like, and in many ways, like if I was in the strategy room right now, that'd be really tempting for me, right? I do think that there is a sense in which companies or just institutions more broadly, set aside companies, but sort of like institutions, organizations, people, if you're not using AI models on a regular part of your day-to-day business, you don't actually understand what they're capable of. I was speaking with a friend and colleague of mine yesterday where he was talking about how, he was using the latest Claude model to look at a particular medical issue that he had. Thank God it
Okay.
was minor, ultimately. It was like weird, scary test result that ended up, thank God, being not a big
Mhm.
deal.
Mhm.
But he was comfortable doing that with Claude in a
Right.
way that I think many people wouldn't have been because he has so much experience using it in other professional contexts. He's like, okay, I know more or less in which ways I can trust this, how to
Right.
cross check these answers, how to follow up, like how far should I push this or not? Where does it start looking a little fishy? And like that's something that if you just never use these models, you wouldn't have the ability to do. I don't think you need to necessarily say I should drop everything and work on it. People got to work on their other responsibilities they already have. But I
Of
think
course.
thinking through how to actually use them on a day-to-day basis in your actual to get actual things done. Not like a vanity pilot, not like a proof of concept, but like I've got, Claude Code or Codex or whatever on my whatever, Microsoft Copilot, Gemini, pick your thing, right? I'm using it, I'm actually using it, and I'm actually getting work done that someone would have paid me to do if I was doing it as a human instead of getting a model to do it for me, is the thing that'll give you a real sense of where the capabilities trajectory is heading.
Yeah, a couple of points that I want to emphasize for our audience that you mentioned. One, which we often talk about actually, is AI is on both sides of the risk coin, meaning AI is the thing that is causing the risks, but AI is also going to be the thing that's going to protect you from those risks, right? And so
Absolutely.
that is it's the offender defender analogy that you were talking about. It's going to be on both sides. And the other point that I often talk about is the companies that the biggest risk you can take in this environment is actually sitting on the sidelines and not investing in AI, right? Both because of all the potential positive business implications, but also because you need AI to be a defender in your organization, to protect you and to build your risk kind of environment. So I think for all those reasons, companies that have this kind of thoughtful strategy around it are going to be the ones that really succeed. What in your mind, like if you were a CISO at an organization right now, I'd love for you to leave some wisdom for our audience. What would be the things you would focus on immediately?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. I think there's a bunch of things I'd focus on. The first, just to say it again, really eat your Wheaties on doing your basics, right? Like
Mhm.
those are the things that the models are relatively tireless. If an attacker is using them, they're willing to do the boring stuff first if it just works. So make
Okay.
sure like you're keeping your environment patched and up to date. You've got good internal monitoring. You've got good two-factor authentication wherever you can. All the just sort of eat your
The
Wheaties
basics,
stuff.
the hygiene. Yep.
The basic hygiene, get that done.
Okay.
The second thing I'd say is start thinking about what's going to happen when, the business side is going to come to you with a bunch of asks and
Mhm.
figure out how to get yourself ready for them. You know, security is at the end of the day, it's intended to be, it has a moral obligation, but at the end of the day, it's also an enabler of the business, right? And so think where the business is going. We're seeing already early stages, a couple days ago, Anthropic announced that they have sort of a drop-in Claude agent that you can just use as another Slack account effectively,
Right.
right? So like
Right.
start thinking through how does your permissions model work if you sort of have like many, many orders of agents that are treating more like sort of employees in terms of the permissions and in terms of what they're being asked to do than in sort of like a discrete piece of software. I also think like another thing I would think about in that space is what happens when you suddenly have a lot of people in the workspace who previously didn't write code and who are now writing a lot of code kind of accidentally, right? I today had Claude write for me, several thousand lines of code in order to add things to our CRM here at Palisade, right? At a list of people I'd met at a conference earlier this week. And I like skimmed it to make sure that it didn't seem like it was doing anything malicious, but I didn't really look at it, right? And like
Right.
a lot of people aren't really looking at their code. And so
Right.
think through like at the desktop level, like, okay, yeah, that business analyst before, I never had to really worry if they had permissions in certain kinds of ways to touch production or touch certain databases because they were only ever doing like just a pull of a CSV file of it or whatever. But actually, they have permissions to take down prod if they want to. And
Yes.
I need to think through not just what like Dave can do, what Dave's laptop, if it's using Claude, can
Exactly.
do. And so I think, there might be areas where you actually want to tighten up a lot your permissions with regards to humans, because the humans now have access to AI. And, think not just only like what you're allowing them to use, but what they might be using in a shadow IT kind of way, right? And the last thing I'd say is this. I think it's very easy to get freaked out by all of this. As you said, I stay up late and I think about a lot of this. But I really do think that like there is this sense in which the bigger trick here is less sort of like obsessively monitoring the situation with regards to sort of particular details of the latest launches of the latest companies. Eh,
Mhm.
They're launching too much. You can't keep up with it. Think about the overall trajectory that your business is on. Think about like, hey, I expect models about a year from now are going to be really good at being agents. I should really think systematically about
And
that.
plan for that, and plan
Plan
for
for that. It doesn't matter if it gets launched in like November versus December. I mean, maybe it matters a little bit for like your Gantt chart or whatever, but like it doesn't really matter. You just kind of know that it's going to happen at some point over the next year or so, and you're starting to plan towards it and starting to get your team to work on it, and then sort of execute. And best of luck of skill to everyone. Oh, one more thing I would say, which is
Yeah.
uh, I think policymakers in DC are very interested in the cybersecurity aspects of
Yep.
AI right now, both for defense and offense, right? And so I think, you know, would encourage folks to the extent they already are comfortable, maybe if they're a little uncomfortable with talking to DC about those things, whether they do it themselves or through gov relations or whatever, to like really share those insights with DC, because I think helping people mark their beliefs to market in DC will be quite helpful. And so, if you're seeing, hey, like actually we got a lot of advantage out of this like new thing that this company launched, and like we really want you to encourage defenders to do this, or hey, we're really getting worried about this thing that we're starting to see that's starting to be business enterprise fraud against our business, and we'd love some additional information sharing or protection or whatever. Like, let people know, because this is actually something that is much higher on DC's radar than I think is obvious from outside DC. And so tell your GR teams to be doing that.
That's great advice. I like your Dave as a CISO for a day advice there. And I want to close on a quote that I like that connects to some points that you made by Jack Clark, the co-founder of Anthropic. And I think this is a great point. As agents, if you think about the exponential curve of this technology, and as agents become better and better at what they do, you talked about this, the automation curve and what's possible. More and more of the work in your organization is going to get done by AI agents. And so the role of the company and the organization and the humans is really going to be around risk management. It's really going to be fundamentally around how are we overseeing these technologies? How are we reviewing? How are we intervening? And how are we managing the risk as it does these tasks? And so you hinted on that a little bit with this code review point of view, where we've seen, right, a lot of companies now use AI agents to do the code and
Absolutely.
to build code, but then the humans now have to be more involved in the code review, right? Which
Yep.
is risk management, right? So the work shifts. The work shifts from writing the code to reviewing the code. And then over time, more AI will review the code, but still the humans will have to have the last eyes on it as well, right? And so
Yep.
that shift on that spectrum of doing to reviewing to risk management is going to shift over time, and I think that's what a couple organizations are also planning for as well. So look, we could go on a lot further and a lot longer, but this was a great conversation. Look forward to picking up this with you another time. But Dave, thanks again for joining, and really enjoyed this chat.
So did I. Thanks so much for having me on, Guru.
Awesome.